Hello everyone, welcome to our webinar. I am Daita Sergi, Education Programs Manager with AASHE, and I'll be the moderator today. It is my pleasure to welcome you all. As many of you know, AASHE's mission is to inspire and catalyze higher education to lead the global sustainability transformation. We are an international association of about 1,000 members spread across more than 20 countries, including Canada and Oman. We serve as the professional home for campus sustainability staff, but we offer resources for everyone in higher education. We provide an expansive collection of online resources, networking tools, and educational events, such as today's webinar, and an annual conference and expo, which will be held in Pittsburgh, October 2nd to the 5th. The call for proposal for all oral presentation types is closed, but you can still submit for a poster or networking meeting. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. Everyone in the audience is on mute, but please feel free to ask questions or provide comments at any point during the presentation. You can do that by typing them in the questions pane in the control panel on your screen. If you have additional questions, please email them to education@aashe.org and we will get back to you. At the end of the webinar, you'll have the opportunity to provide feedback regarding today's presentation. We take your suggestions into account when planning for future webinars, so please do provide this feedback. Please note this webinar is being recorded. If you experience technical difficulties or have to leave early, you and others can view the recording later. The recording with the presentation materials will all be available in the Campus Sustainability Hub after the live broadcast. At this time, I'd like to introduce today's presenter. Dr. Weisskopf is an associate professor of sociology at Radford University. Her research interests include social psychology and applied sociology. She recently published a comparative study of the efficacy of intervention strategies on student electricity use in campus residence halls, which was an AASHE 2017 Campus Sustainability Research winner. And today, Alison will tell us more about it. At this time, I would like to welcome all attendees and thank you for joining us today. Alison, I'm going to turn things over to you to get us started.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm going to assume that everyone is there. I want to first thank you for, kind of being persistent about being here. I know that I had been scheduled to do this a couple times before and definitely had some weather things and lost power out here in the Appalachian Mountains, and so it was difficult for me to do this, but here we are today, and I appreciate that you kind of stuck with me to get here. I do want to note before I get started that this was really, the work that I'm going to talk about today was really a team effort. You know, it couldn't have been possible without my fantastic colleagues, Rick Roth, Dennis Grady, and Julio Stevens, and really, our collaboration reflects the kind of commitment across campus to sustainability and kind of moving toward a greener campus. We're a collection of across disciplines. I'm a sociologist, Rick is a geospatial scientist, Dennis is a political scientist, and Julio was our director of sustainability at the time. And so this is really a collaborative effort, and I think reflects more broadly what we're trying to do here on Radford. On Radford's campus. So I just want to give you a little bit of background on where we are. So Radford is in Southwest Virginia. It's pretty close to West Virginia. We're right near the Appalachian Mountains. And that picture there is a picture of our campus, and you can see the Appalachian Mountains in the background there. I actually live out there in the mountains, and it's a beautiful place. We are a co-educational comprehensive public university. We have about 9,000 undergraduate students, give or take a few hundred, depending on demand out there. And we have about 1,000 graduate students. We're disproportionately female students, and a lot of our students are first-generation students. Most of our faculty are also very dedicated to teaching. And one other thing that I think is really important to know about our institution is that while we're a residential kind of campus, only about a quarter of our students can actually live on campus or in campus facilities. So about 3/4 of our students live off campus, which is something we're trying to address in terms of thinking about how that affects our ability in terms of environmentally responsible behaviors and encouraging that among our students, especially when they're off campus. So let me give you a little bit of background too about sustainability at Radford more generally. Radford aims to be a model for sustainable campus practices and policies, and to more broadly be a good steward of its economic, social, and environmental resources. We're also committing to reducing energy consumptions and costs, and building upon broader sustainability efforts across campus. For the past 2 decades, Radford has invested in energy-efficient buildings and materials, implementing many conservation efforts on campus, including retrofitting campus lighting, installing motion sensors, and energy management controls and equipment upgrades. So there's been a movement across our campus to kind of move the needle on sustainability, as it were, and especially in terms of energy. We have recently installed digital submetering for all electricity. Steam and water has been installed in all the major buildings. And we see energy use in real time now, which allows us to gather that data and use it to inform a lot of the decision making on campus. At the time that we published this article, 5 buildings had been had earned the Energy Star Efficient certification from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and at the time that we published it, it was also, we had a campus with more certified residence hall than any other campus in the Commonwealth. So it's a point of pride for us. We adopted the ACUPCC in 2009, I'm sorry, and have really been trying to do a lot more of introspection, kind of looking at how we're impacting our environment and what we can do to reduce that impact. The project that we undertook was really focused on energy consumption, especially electricity and water, but this project is particularly focused on electricity and in campus residence halls. And so for the project, we applied for and were awarded a Jesse Ball DuPont Fund Foundation grant, and we proposed a 3-pronged energy efficient enhancement project that would help us get some more data, hopefully raise awareness, and then address student, faculty, staff behaviors in a way that could help us reduce energy cost. And so we were overall trying to kind of take a holistic approach to the reduction of energy consumption and costs on campus. And so we conducted a detailed energy audit at first that became a baseline for us. And then we installed some energy dashboards across campus, and part of the funding from that grant also helped us create a sustainability fellow that allowed us to integrate disparate parts and entities around campus to kind of allow everyone to know what everyone else was doing at the university in a more in terms of their efforts regarding sustainability. I would say that that's probably still a problem on our campus. The right hand doesn't always know what the left hand is doing, and so there's a real effort to try to integrate some of those activities, but without a way to know what everyone else is doing. It makes it a little bit hard, so that sustainability fellow helped us a lot. And with this fund and the grant that we got from the Jesse Ball DuPont Fund, we were able to undertake the project that I'll talk about today. And this is a portion of the project. We have some other parts that we're working on that I'd be happy to talk about at the end if you're interested. So I want to talk first about some of the relevant literature. We started with this looking at student attitudes, behaviors, and then kind of what are the interventions out there and how they've been helpful or not. And much of what we found is that the literature about students' attitudes and behaviors really demonstrated that if you're trying to use attitudes to move the needle on behaviors, you might not get a whole lot of bang for your buck. And at most, we were seeing kind of uneven effects. attitudes as a mechanism for approaching behavioral changes are only one part of the equation. A lot of the literature out there about attitudes and behaviors tends to invoke a theory of planned behavior by Fishbein and Asian, depending on which of the early work you use. It tries to explain how our attitudes are related to our behaviors, and while it has been useful for predicting some showing the relationship between attitudes and behaviors, what we do know is that our behaviors depend upon more than just our attitudes. So it's both motivation, that is the intention, and our ability to just control those things. And then there are a series of beliefs, behavioral, normative, and control that created a complex interplay that determines whether or not our behaviors about, say, recycling or energy conservation or something like that actually match the attitudes we have. And the link between attitudes and behaviors has been pretty weak historically and kind of uneven. Looking at the literature about kind of changing students' behaviors in terms of kind of environmentally responsible behaviors, whether that's recycling or energy conservation, those kinds of things, is that there have been a series, researchers have tried a series of both passive and kind of active strategies or interventions to encourage students to change their behavior. And those passive things included things like signs, just letting students know that they're living in kind of green buildings, sending emails to remind students about the efforts of the institution, and then even more engaged or active kind of strategies, which would involve kind of more intensive workshops, knowledge building, and all of that has been in an effort to kind of produce these environmentally responsible behaviors. Those strategies, as the relationship between attitudes and behaviors has been shown, has been really uneven. Sometimes there's some support for those passive strategies for producing the kind of changes in behavior that you want, and other times the literature suggests that passive strategies do absolutely nothing. And the same can be said for those active strategies. Occasionally we see support for those in-depth kind of interventions like workshops and those things. But what we did find in the literature in terms of things that were really working were energy dashboards, or those high resolution real-time wireless data monitoring kind of displays that allow students, faculty, staff, everyone to kind of see what energy consumption looks like at the moment. You can interact with it, touch it, bring up different kinds of displays, and that there was getting some real traction in the literature. And we saw part of what we were trying to do here is fitting in really well with that literature. And specifically, we used Peterson and colleagues' 2007 article that looked at the use of these kind of dashboards to produce or reduce energy consumption. And so we use that as a launching point for this particular study, and thinking about how can we make advancements, how can we refine what we know, can we kind of isolate the effects of these passive and active strategies in ways that would help us better understand which would be more useful in a campus context, especially in residence halls. And so let me tell you a little bit more then about the method and design. So first, we're using a quasi-experimental design in our study, and I'll get to the quasi-experimental part, what makes it that in just a second. But what I want to say is, first of all, we have these 4 matched buildings on campus. It's called the Governor's Quad. They're all identical. They were all remodeled in 2010 in exactly the same way. They had numerous energy efficient improvements. And they're heated with steam from gas-fired central campus steam plant and cooled by electricity and chillers to chill water. Each of those dorms can house about 150 undergraduate students, and they're all freshmen. So these are exclusively freshman dorms. Our study was quasi-experimental in the sense that we didn't have any choice, let's see, in how the students were going to be assigned to those dorms. So we didn't have any control over that, but we had control over which dorms we selected, and then we randomly assigned the condition to those dorms. So there were some things that were outside of our control here, which which is a place, I think, for improvement. We did collect this data over a 2-year period, and it's also important to note that in these particular dorms, students' ability to influence energy use is really kind of limited, particularly in the areas of heating and cooling. So student room temperatures in all 4 of these dorms is identical, and students can only adjust the temperature about 5 degrees either way, hotter or colder. And if the windows in the room are open, then the heating and cooling units turn off for that room. So one of the things we kind of knew going in was that that students had little control over that, but if we could demonstrate any effect even with that little control, it might have big implications for the kind of energy reduction we might be able to see. Also, and importantly, each of these halls was managed by a resident director, and that had resident advisors or RAs, and that becomes important later when I'm going to talk about the results a little bit. In terms of how we conducted this study, after we randomly assigned those dorms to a condition, there were 4 conditions. One was a control condition, where there was no intervention. One was a passive condition where they just we installed one of the energy dashboards. One was an active where they just had conservation programming, and I'll talk about that just a little bit in a second. And then in one of the other dorms, we combined those 2 interventions. So we had the energy dashboard and we had conservation programming that was a more active version of an intervention. And so the way that we implemented that was that we had a graduate assistant, that sustainability fellow, that had a background in residential life, and that person was assigned to work with students, the RDs, and the RAs to gain access to the residence halls and residents, and to schedule and implement all the programming. And I think from a design point of view, one of the things that that we do here relative to the Peterson et al. Group is we kind of move the needle forward in terms of design. So our study was over a 2-year period, so we have a lot of data, and we use matched buildings, which they didn't have access to. And so we are, while there are many things that we aren't able to control, there are plenty of exogenous factors that we were able to kind of get a hold of, and we're able to, in ways that they weren't, is kind of implement the 2 different kinds of strategies in the same study, and then actually compare those effects, and looking at how they might combine together to create different kinds of effects. So that's the basic methodological point, but I want to talk a little bit more about those strategies, moving from the design to kind of what those different strategies look like. As I said, the passive intervention was really an energy dashboard. So these were in 2 of those dorms, the passive intervention and the combined intervention. These were installed in the main high traffic areas of the dorms. One of the things that's nice about these is you can kind of control what students are going to see. These were produced by the Lucid Design Group, and so we could control what students would see on here. That is, some of these you can allow them to see what's happening in that comparisons tab with other dorms if they're equally outfitted, and we wanted to keep that from happening so that it didn't appear that we were picking up a competition effect. So we controlled some of those things that students could see, but as you can see down at the bottom, they could look at electricity use, water use, heating, they could look at the weather, they could also get green tips. And so this was just all the students were introduced to this when they moved into the hall, and they could go up and interact with it as they wanted. And so in that way, it was in the environment, but certainly not something that was thrust upon them in any way. They would have to kind of seek that out. Our alternative to that was the active intervention, that programming that I was talking about, and this tends, so we have this graduate assistant who helped schedule this stuff, and it tended to include things like we distributed some surveys with this particular study too that I'm not going to report on today, but as part of this project that we're still working on. And so students the floors that completed the most surveys then were able to get a pizza party, and so she helped implement all of that. She also distributed water bottles that were reusable to all the students, and they had like a little craft time where they personalized those things. They did some competitions that are common on college campuses, Recycle Mania. They had Earth Day activities. There were efforts to screen films like kilowatt hours that they try to entice students to with the pizza, drinks. Apparently, whenever you can give free food out, it helps students show up. So that's the difference in kind of what we were trying to do in terms of active and passive interventions. And what was important here for both of these things is that especially for the active things, students had to select into those, and we didn't have any control again over who was actively participating in this stuff, nor did we have control over the more passive kind of intervention. That is, would they be interacting with the energy dashboard? And I think it's also important to note here that that all of those active programming interventions had to require, or literally required, the kind of cooperation at every level in that residence hall. So RDs, RAs, and again, I'm going to come back to that in a second. So I want to talk about what we expected and kind of heading into it, what did we think we would find? For the control condition, that became our point of comparison. So we instituted no intervention whatsoever, and we didn't expect there to be a change from one point in time to another point in time, like beginning, end of the semester. In the passive condition, that is the dashboard, we thought, given what Peterson and colleagues found, that there would be a reduction in energy or electricity use in that particular dorm. Given the unevenness of the literature, as it were, regarding the efficacy of that active programming, we just weren't sure what we would find. And then also, we weren't sure if in the end what we would find in that combined condition would be an additive effect, that if the active programming produced a reduction, that would be somehow added on to the passive effect, or if it would, by an order of magnitude increase energy reduction. So we weren't quite sure what to expect in those final two conditions. But I'll talk a little bit about the analytical model that we used. I think one of the things that I think helps us move the ball forward here and kind of understanding how interventions work is that we use some really kind of nuanced and sophisticated control variables and here in the way that we constructed them. So first of all, our dependent variable was the kilowatt per hours per student per day. So what we did is we just standardized the amount of energy used in a building, the amount of electricity used by the number of students in that building per day. And so we're able to get all those numbers and come up with a kilowatt hours per student per day. So that's our dependent variable. Our control variables, I think, are where we got the most purchase in terms of kind of isolating some of those effects that I was talking about. So we have a dummy variable that is a variable for the academic year. Because it spanned 2 years, we wanted to make sure that we weren't finding something that was just unique to a single year. And if that was, maybe figuring out what the reason for that was. We also had a series of nominal variables that allowed us to control for the day of the week and then also the month. Then we had this, what I thought was kind of an interesting variable that allowed us to capture the magnitude of the heating degree day and cooling degree day. And so the heating and cooling degree day variables just tell us a little bit about the temperature and the weather, so it allows us to control that for that. And so it reflects the deviation of the outside temperature from the base temperature of 65 degrees for all the residence halls. So if the outside temperature on a given day was 65, the value of both the heating degree day and cooling degree day variables would be 0. Then if the outside temperature was 68.5, the value of the heating degree day variable would be zero, and for the cooling degree day, it would be 3.5. So that's kind of the way that that variable worked. And it allows us to capture something about the variability in the weather, right? And so we thought those were helpful. And then our actual independent variables in the study then were those controls. So was it the passive condition, active, and combined, all being compared to the control condition where there was no intervention. And so what did we find? We actually found some interesting things. So I don't want to get too deep into the woods with regard to the OLS regression models. I kind of want to, get a fuller view, more holistic treatment of it. So basically, when we control for all the variables, and I mean, I can get into the minutia if you want. Let me say that in the question and answer. I'd be happy to answer some of those questions. But I'm showing you here the results by year, and it's because we actually found an interesting interaction effect by year that, again, I can talk about too in the end if you have questions about that. But I want to show you the differences by year here to capture that effect, and because I think it also muddles it down to collapse them. The data were all pooled for analysis. And on the right side, I'm not sure, the 2012-2013 year, you can see that those are the predicted use, the predicted kilowatt hours per student per variable. That's what you're seeing on both sides. And you see that in that 2012-2013 year, all the bars there are lower than the control variables. So you have the gray bar here is 8.86, and that is the passive condition, and then our active condition is 8.21, and then for the combined is 9.08. The important first takeaway is that all these bars are lower. That is, there's a reduction in every single one of these conditions relative to this control condition where nothing happened. And that's useful. And then if you look over here, you actually see the same thing in the 13-14 year, just barely, but they're all lower. And so I think that's an important takeaway. First is that if you do something, you're likely to reduce the electricity use among students in their residence halls. I will say that statistically speaking, in neither year was the combined model a significant reduction. And I'm going to come back to that combined model because there's some interesting effects going on there. But for both years, the passive and the active interventions produced significant reductions in electricity use. So that's in 2012 and 13, there was a significant reduction here and then over here. The magnitude of those reductions are a little bit different, and I'm happy to talk about that later too. But the other really interesting thing is that while using a passive intervention seemed to reduce, and active also seemed to reduce, when we put those together in both years, we see this bounce back almost at the same levels that are in the control condition, which was surprising to us. We hadn't anticipated that in the least. And so we weren't sure what was happening there. I don't know if it was an overload effect, if too many interventions just overwhelm students and they just throw up their hands figuring they can't do anything to affect any of this. But ultimately, combining these interventions actually made them look more like the group of students who were receiving zero intervention, which was interesting and entirely unexpected. And so we took this and we tried to think of some of the practical implications for this. And so we tried to figure out what would the cost savings look like if we put these different strategies in place. And so this graph depicts the annual electricity savings associated with each of those intervention strategies, and assumes maximum occupancy in each of those dorms. And we got 13 cents per kilowatt hour from our facilities folks as a cost. So that this is based on our own data, but all interventions relative to the control are associated with savings during the 2-year period of the study. The active intervention is associated with the largest savings, not surprising because we kind of saw that coming in the last one. And the savings for this condition are twice the savings for the passive intervention strategy. So actually seeing really big gains there. And then we see that those savings kind of go away, right, when we're combining those. So consistent with the results more broadly, we can see the relative benefits of the active strategy over the passive strategy. And again, we weren't sure what to expect, but we were kind of shocked to see this, and I'll kind of get to that in a second. I do want to say that while we're looking at those costs, it's important to also note that none of these interventions was without its own costs, and I think that that's something important to consider when we're thinking about doing this on a college campus. And so, the equipment that we had to use in that passive strategy cost almost $12,000 to get installed, and then there was also a $700 maintenance fee agreement, and so it was quite a big investment upfront. And that passive condition would, of course, require that you maintain not only the software licensure, but those screens and update them as needed, and that kind of stuff. The cost for implementing that active intervention that we used, all that programming, the movies, the activities, the competitions, is a little bit more difficult. Our graduate student received a stipend for doing that work in those residence halls, and that was about 10 hours a week, and it was about $9,500 for the academic year. And that was about enough time. That 10 hours a week was enough to do these interventions across both of the dorms. So we're kind of able to split that cost to about $4,500 per building, which isn't bad. But unlike the passive intervention strategy, there's that cost will happen every single year, right? So there's no diminishing costs. There's no point where you kind of can flip that over, that cost savings, into kind of a net savings overall. Moreover, there were other costs associated with having that kind of implementation strategy, whether it's the cost of supervising that student, the cost for the residents folks to assist us. And so it was a little harder for us to estimate what that savings might look like. But as it's happening on a college campus, it seems at the very least that having education be a component of this is part of our mission. And so one of the things that we thought that was fantastic about this is not only that the students who served these roles for us got really fantastic experience in a project and doing research, but also they were able to collect some of their own data. So they're real intangibles that we can't capture with some of those costs. So ultimately, though, our results suggest that any kind of intervention is going to reduce those electricity costs, but perhaps also a warning against maybe combining those. Again, we're not quite sure what was happening there with that. And so I just want to talk a little bit about the kind of conclusions that we drew. So those active collaboration, the use of those active and passive interventions did produce those declines. But I do want to say that active collaboration for us, the finding that it was doing anything, was in the end absolutely shocking to us, because we felt like we weren't getting much buy-in at all from students. And so when I'm using the word active here, it was kind of a passive kind of active intervention, really. so as I said, there were tours, film showings, talks, activities, and a lot of those were actually very poorly attended or not attended at all. And so we weren't expecting initially for there to be any effect based on the kind of self-selection into those activities on the part of students. And for then it to be associated with the largest reduction in electricity use was really kind of shocking to us. And I think what we kind of came away with was maybe what we were through those strategies and it being constantly promoted and those kinds of things. What we were saying was, here's a cultural component of the local attitudes that says this is important. So we weren't sure, but that was really surprising to us, and that we were a little surprised by this piling on effect. That is, that students maybe felt bombarded when we gave them both passive and active strategies and then just rejected those messages entirely. If it was because they felt like they couldn't do anything, or whether what they were doing had no impact because maybe they could see that they were doing things, and then not seeing the net results on those energy dashboards is something that we weren't sure about. But I also think that's worth further explorations. So although we kind of think our research allowed us to improve on those, kind of where the literature was headed with intervention strategies and their relative efficacy, there are, to be sure, some opportunities to improve, especially the design through the human components. One of the things that we found through implementing those more active passive strategies, the ones where we had our graduate assistant working with us to do the programming in the dorms, was it really revealed to us that it was essential that we have the kind of buy-in and commitment that we needed in the residence halls, from the RAs on every floor all the way up to the residence directors. And without those kinds of buy-in and commitments all the way through, that can really hinder your efforts. And we found that with our GA, where there wasn't kind of people getting on board with the project in some of those residence halls, it made it more difficult to do some of this, and thus, kind of hindered our ability to affect energy consumption. And if we kind of think back about that theory of planned behavior, and the relationship between attitudes and behaviors, you can imagine how those gatekeepers, whether it's RDs or RAs, and their personal commitments and engagement to sustainable efforts are profoundly important for setting that kind of cultural norm or normative context in which individual and attitudes and behaviors are situated. And so if you're not getting that allows you that opportunity to provide those kinds of messages to students, it's going to make it that much more difficult to move the meter on electricity use, I guess. So thanks so much. I really look forward to answering any questions you might have, and I'll send it back to you.
Thank you so much, Allison, for sharing all this data and analysis with us. It was very interesting to hear and see what you had done. So I'll remind everyone that you can send your questions via the questions pane on the GoToWebinar control panel, and we will actually get started because we have a couple. So the first question was about the dashboards. Are they physically in the space, or are they just online?
No, these were physically in the space. So as students walked out, it was a big display monitor that was in usually the lobby, the main entrance of the building. So it was a high traffic area, kind of situated near the doors. So students would pass by them as they walked in and out of the buildings.
Thank you. Next question. How did you get admin buy-in, and who needed to be involved from the different departments and higher-ups for the research and the project to take place? It sounds like a few different departments had to be involved for all of this to happen. Would you mind detailing a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think so I, on our campus, I think most of these efforts tend to be grassrootsy in the sense that faculty have a lot more collaborative intentions and projects that are cross-cutting across disciplines. Um, and I and that right hand not knowing what the left hand is doing is it becomes a real barrier to change on our campus. And so there was a lot of collaboration at the faculty level. But in a large part, going up any higher, it's been a lot more difficult to get that kind of collaboration, and that's something we're aiming toward at Radford. Our new strategic plan is coming out, and sustainability is one of the top 7 goals of or values that we identify in that strategic plan. And I'm hoping that is a way that the university community and administration is really signaling that we're ready for a change to move in that direction.
Thank you. There's another question about the dashboards. Were they monitored to see how much they were used?
I don't have that data. I suspect that data is somewhere, and that is a really good idea, especially as we move forward to see if we can pull some data off there. No doubt, those dashboards have the ability to identify when and how those were interacted with. Thank you for that idea.
Thank you. So, what would you recommend on what we need to initially prepare or think about in order to start this kind of project?
I guess from a cost perspective, and depending on the extent of cooperation you have at your campus, my sense is that you might be able to achieve real cost reductions and real reductions in energy, electricity use by starting with peer educators or some of those interventions at the ground level, instead of necessarily investing in some of this other stuff. There's because students can have such a small impact, especially in our setting, on their electricity use, that 5 degrees either way. We wondered if seeing that there wasn't a big change on those boards was suppressing some of their own efforts in their dorms. So I think having that local maybe representatives on every floor that help do some of this programming. But I think it's essential that even if you do that, you've got to have that buy-in all the way up through the residence hall and on the other side of the house, as it were, in academic affairs, in student affairs, and having people in key places that all think this is important and help you to institute some of this stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Were the exact same active events done in both the active and combined conditions?
I'm sorry, I kind of lost you there a second.
I apologize. So, were the exact same active events, so the same type of activities done in both active and combined conditions?
Yeah, so any of the programming the active programming that we did was identical. Because we had one person, there might be a day or two delay for getting those things scheduled and carried out, but all students had exposure to the exact same kind of programming, or at least opportunities for the exact same programming. And that was one of the controls that we wanted to have, where there were all those exogenous things that we couldn't control. We wanted to make sure that among those things that we could, that it was as identical as possible. So yeah, everybody got the same thing.
Thank you. You mentioned when windows were open, the heating or cooling would shut down. Do you have more details on that?
I wish that I could answer that question. That is my colleagues in geospatial sciences are a lot more familiar with that, and they couldn't be here with me today. I'm not sure how that works. I know that the metering worked so we could get data at the 15-minute intervals, so we could get some really finely grained data, and we're able to see these effects in different points, in different kind of cuts of time. But about how that shut off the heating and cooling systems, I'm sorry, I can't answer that.
Thank you. Can you speak to any of your thoughts or established theory as to how or if the efforts get translated from the most committed and interested students, so those that interact with the dashboards, those that attend the programming, to the students who are more apathetic or uninterested?
Yeah, I think you're almost always talking about a selection effect here. So I think those students who are already interested in that stuff are going to select in, and it's going to potentially confirm where they're already at and or strengthen those attitudes, right? And I think that it's one reason to have that out there in the normative environment for every student, regardless of where they are, whether they're apathetic or whether they're invested. If that messaging and programming is out there in the normative environment, then it it's a message that might tip the scale toward them engaging in more environmentally responsible behaviors. Um, Now, whether that happens all the time, I don't know, but my sense is that when you have that as part of that milieu in which they're trying to make decisions, it becomes an important bridge from the 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 environment, the writ large, and their own kind of cognitive environment about what's important and what's not. And perhaps what it does is it helps bring those apathetic people closer to the cultural message that you're trying to perpetuate in your campus environment.
Thank you. Also, talking about the students, can you talk more about how the students perceive these programs? What did they say they got the most of from these programs, and was there a difference between the active versus passive or combined?
I have to say we tried to not interact with the students short of that programming feature. These students didn't know that this study was going on. And with the exception of us collecting a survey at the beginning and end of every semester. So we collected a survey that has some of their attitudes, their behaviors, their demographic characteristics. We largely didn't interact with them. And so that's, I think, one of the reasons why we don't know what happened in that piling on effect. That remains a mystery for us because we didn't have the opportunity to interact with those students, with the exception of the GA, who, while she kept a detailed log, both GAs, both years, kept detailed logs. She just didn't see a lot of buy-in in that active kind of programming stuff. I don't think it was outright rejection. I think the students who came were happy to be there, but I think more generally, it was just students not selecting into those opportunities. So we didn't have a chance to find out, oh, was this a big, an important thing to you? How did it influence you? But part of that was by design, trying to not unintentionally influence their behaviors by letting them know that we were studying them in terms of their electricity use.
Great, thank you. We have one more question, so I will encourage everyone who's on the webinar to submit your questions if you have any more, because we still have a couple of minutes left, so we can address a couple more. So, Allison, where are you going to take this next, and what would you like to see happening in the next few years?
That's a great question. So, one of the other things that we have available to us is some water use data from these same dorms over the same period of time. So, we're interested to see, where maybe heating and cooling they can only affect in small ways. They have way more control over that water use. So we wanted to look at that and see if these strategies had similar or different effects on that. As a sociologist, as the sociologist on the team, I'm particularly interested in their attitudes. I have to admit to being a social psychologist, so I'm particularly interested in attitudes, looking at whether any of this might have moved the needle for those students in terms of the way that they were thinking about sustainability. Also looking at, how is their unwitting or unknowing participation in this, did it shape any of those, and was there change over time? And that's one thing that we couldn't do here. we could just look at reductions, but we couldn't look at change over time. I think if we want to know, if we want to get to the core of how these kinds of interventions work, what we need to be able to do is model change. And I think that's a point of departure for what we did for future research, and that is to have, those same people at multiple points in time so that we can model change instead of just looking at overall reductions and the efficacy of these strategies. So those are two places that that we're hoping to go with some of these data in the future.
Thank you so much, Allison. Before we conclude today's webinar, I want to remind everyone about our next webinar, which will take place next week, Wednesday, also starting at 3 p.m. Join this webinar to learn how to lead the World Climate Simulation, a mock UN climate negotiation with the student audiences you work with. You can learn more about this webinar and our other professional development offerings. We have, for example, 3 workshops happening this summer that we would love to have you attend on our website, and I hope you'll join us again. A final reminder to please fill out the post-webinar survey, which will show up on your screen once the webinar ends. Thank you again, Allison, for sharing this very interesting data and study with us, and thank you everyone for attending. If you have additional questions, please email them to education@aashe.org or myself directly, daita.sergi@aashe.org. And the recording with the presentation slides will be available in the Campus Sustainability Hub tomorrow, and you will receive an email once they're uploaded. Thank you so much. Have a good day, everyone.